I was gone for 48 hours. That's all it took. 48 hours to walk my daughter down the aisle, cry like an idiot during the father-daughter dance, eat too much wedding cake, and drive home thinking life was pretty good. Then I turned onto my street and realized something was wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. You know how sometimes you've lived somewhere so long that your brain notices a change before you do? That was me. I was still wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to the wedding. My tie was hanging loose around my neck. My coffee had gone cold somewhere around Knoxville, and I was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep. But the second I pulled into Oak Ridge Lane, something fell off. The sky looked bigger, brighter. Wrong. I slowed down and stared through my windshield. Then it hit me. The tree line behind my house was gone. Not thinner, not trimmed. Gone. I remember actually laughing for a second because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. No way, I said out loud to nobody. Then I pulled into my driveway. The smell hit first. Fresh cut oak. If you've ever split firewood, you know that smell. Sweet, earthy, almost like vanilla mixed with damp soil. Usually it's a comforting smell. That day it felt like walking into a funeral home. I got out of my truck and stood there. My backyard looked like a crime scene. 3 giant white oaks had disappeared. 3 trees that had stood on that property longer than anybody currently living on the street. Reduced to stumps. Just stumps and sawdust. I didn't move for a while. I just stared. Those trees weren't decorations. One of them had a scar about 8 feet up where I'd fallen out of it when I was 10. Another still carried the faint outline of initials I'd carved with a pocket knife when I was 12 and stupid enough to think girls would be impressed by that sort of thing. The biggest one, that one mattered most. That's where I proposed to my wife, Laura. That's where our son broke his arm trying to jump from a tire swing. That's where my daughter Emma used to sit with a flashlight reading books when she thought nobody could find her. You don't lose something like that and shrug it off. Not if you're human. I dropped my suitcase on the porch and walked straight toward the fence. And that's when I saw my neighbor. Her name was Vanessa Crowley. At least back then it was. Vanessa had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years earlier after buying the old Bennett property. The Bennett house had been one of those beautiful historic homes people put on Christmas cards. 2 months after buying it, she bulldozed the entire thing. In its place, she built what looked like a luxury resort pretending to be a house. Glass walls, steel beams, outdoor kitchen, infinity pool, fire features. The whole thing looked like it belonged in Arizona instead of Eastern Tennessee. Now she was floating in that infinity pool wearing oversized sunglasses, holding a drink, staring out across the valley. And for the first time since she'd moved in, she had a completely unobstructed view. I stopped at the fence. She noticed me immediately. For half a second, she looked surprised. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile somebody gives when they've already won. "Welcome back, Grant," she called. I looked past her toward the open skyline where my trees used to stand. Then back at her. "You cut them down." Not a question. A statement. She slowly lowered her sunglasses. "Those trees were hazardous." I felt something tighten inside my chest. Hazardous. We had them assessed. We, the tree service. "You stared at her." She stared right back. No guilt. No hesitation. Nothing. Just confidence. The kind of confidence people get when they're convinced money can solve every problem. "You came onto my property," I said. She shrugged. It was an emergency situation. I looked at the 3 stumps, then at the perfect sunset view behind her, then back at her again. And right there, standing between those piles of sawdust and her $1 million pool, I realized something. This wasn't about safety. It had never been about safety. She wanted a better view. And somehow, while I was dancing with my daughter at her wedding, she decided that my trees were standing in the way of it. What I didn't know yet was that cutting down those trees was about to become the most expensive decision Vanessa Crowley would ever make. And the reason had been sitting forgotten in my basement for almost 30 years. The funny thing about getting older is that you start keeping things you probably should throw away. Old tax records, broken lamps, boxes full of papers nobody has looked at in decades. 3 nights after my trees came down, I found myself standing in my basement at nearly midnight, digging through exactly those kinds of boxes. Laura thought I'd lost my mind. "You've been down there for 2 hours," she called from the top of the stairs. "I'm looking for something. You don't even know what you're looking for." That part was true. I just had a feeling. A memory. When I was a kid, my Aunt Evelyn used to bring university researchers into our neighborhood. She was an environmental scientist at the state university and spent years studying the forested ridges around our town. I remembered hearing conversations about protected habitats, conservation agreements, migratory species, the kind of stuff kids don't pay attention to, until suddenly they do. I kept digging, box after box, dust everywhere, old photographs, maps, letters. Then I found it, a thick brown binder. The cover was faded almost white. Across the front, written in black marker, were 4 words. Cumberland Ridge Habitat Corridor. My heart started beating faster. I sat right there on the concrete floor and opened it. For the next 2 hours, I read. Then I read it again, and by the time I finished, I wasn't angry anymore. I was interested, because what I'd found changed everything. According to the documents, a cooperative conservation agreement had been established decades earlier between state and federal agencies. Several properties along our ridge had been included. Mine, Vanessa's, half the neighborhood. The purpose was protecting nesting habitat used by monitored migratory bird species. Most of the legal language was dry enough to cure insomnia. But one section practically jumped off the page. Removal of mature canopy trees within designated zones requires environmental review and ecological assessment prior to authorization. Prior authorization. Not afterward. Not maybe. Prior. I kept turning pages. Maps. Survey reports. Correspondence. And then I found a diagram showing protected canopy clusters. 3 red circles. 3 exact locations. The same 3 locations where my trees had stood 3 days earlier. I leaned back against an old shelf and laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly I understood why Vanessa had been so confident. She didn't know. She had absolutely no idea. The next morning, I started making phone calls. At first, I expected the usual bureaucratic runaround. Instead, I got something much more interesting. Concern. The woman at the State Environmental Resource Office became very quiet when I gave her the agreement number. Then she asked me to repeat it. Twice. After that, she asked for my address. By the end of the conversation, she had my photographs, copies of the documents, and every detail I could provide. That afternoon, I contacted 2 additional agencies. The next day, another one. Then I waited, and I told nobody, especially not Vanessa. That part was important, because while she was hosting pool parties and enjoying her new view, people in government offices were beginning to ask questions she didn't even know existed. About a week later, I was grading history exams at my kitchen table when Laura suddenly looked out the window and said, "Grant." I looked up. 2 government vehicles had just pulled into Vanessa's driveway. 1 SUV, 1 pickup truck. 3 people stepped out. Clipboards, field equipment, safety vests, the whole package. Laura slowly smiled. "Would those happen to be the people you've been talking to?" I try not to grin. I believe they might be. Across the fence, Vanessa came outside. The confidence was still there. At first, she walked toward the officials with that same polished smile she used for everyone. The smile that said she expected the world to cooperate. 10 minutes later, that smile was gone. I couldn't hear the conversation. Didn't need to. Body language tells its own story. One investigator pointed toward the hillside, another toward the area around her pool. A third started taking notes. The next thing I knew, they were walking into my yard, measuring stumps, taking photographs, collecting soil samples. One woman crouched beside the largest stump and counted growth rings. Then she looked up at me. "Do you know approximately how old this tree was?" "About 120 years. She shook her head slowly. "That's significant." The word significant sounds harmless until a government investigator says it. Then it sounds expensive. Over the next month, things escalated. Quietly. Relentlessly. First came more inspections. Then environmental reviews. Then legal notices. Vanessa hired attorneys. Plural. That alone told me everything. You don't hire multiple lawyers when things are going well. One afternoon, she caught me getting the mail. "What exactly did you file?" she asked. Her voice sounded calm. Her eyes did not. I filed the truth. She crossed her arms. "My attorneys say those agreements are outdated." Maybe. I nodded. Then again, page 17 says they automatically renew unless formally dissolved. Her expression changed. Just for a second. People don't like discovering somebody they've underestimated can read. She stared at me. I stare back. Finally, she said something that surprised me. You seem to be enjoying this. I thought about that. Honestly. Then I shook my head. No, and I meant it. I would have preferred my trees. That answer landed harder than any insult could have. For the first time since all this started, she didn't have a response. A few days later, the preliminary findings arrived. Unauthorized habitat disruption. Potential environmental violations. Additional review required. Those were the official terms. The unofficial translation was much simpler. Oh, then investigators started looking beyond the trees. And that's where things got really bad. Because once somebody starts digging, they rarely stop at the first shovelful. Questions appeared about the pool excavation. Questions about drainage. Questions about retaining walls. Questions about imported landscaping. Questions about permits. Questions about environmental impact studies. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. The deeper they looked, the worse things became. Then one evening, there was a knock on my front door. I opened it. Vanessa stood there. No sunglasses. No designer smile. No poolside confidence. Just a woman who suddenly realized the ground beneath her might not be nearly as solid as she thought. Can we talk? She asked. I stepped onto the porch. The sun was setting behind us. Ironically, it was still a beautiful view, even without my trees. Vanessa folded her arms, then unfolded them again. People do that when they're nervous. This has gone way too far, she said. I looked at her, then past her shoulder toward the empty spaces where 3 giant oaks used to stand. And for the first time since all this started, I had a feeling the story wasn't even close to over. Because what neither of us knew yet was that the official report was already moving through the system. And when it arrived, it wasn't just going to cost Vanessa money. It was going to threaten everything she'd spent years building. The official report arrived 6 weeks later. I remember the exact moment because I was sitting on my back porch drinking coffee when the mail truck stopped at my mailbox. Most days, mail is boring. Bills, advertisements, things you barely glance at before tossing aside. That day was different. The envelope was thick, the kind that immediately tells you somebody spent a lot of time writing what's inside. I opened it slowly. Then I read every page. Twice. By the time I finished, I just sat there staring out toward the valley. Not smiling, not celebrating, just absorbing it. Because even I hadn't expected it to be this severe. The findings were clear. The removal of the 3 mature oaks had violated active conservation protections. The investigators concluded that the habitat damage triggered a chain of environmental impacts extending beyond the trees themselves. But that wasn't the part that really hurt Vanessa. The real damage came from everything investigators found afterward. Unauthorized excavation, drainage violations, non-compliant hardscape expansion, protected root system destruction, improper grading near the slope. The report read less like a disagreement between neighbors and more like a checklist of mistakes. The final order required ecological restoration of the entire affected area. In plain English, the pool had to go. The patio had to go. The retaining structures had to go. Most of the imported landscaping had to go. And the financial penalties weren't exactly gentle either. When Laura read the number, she nearly dropped the papers. You're kidding. I shook my head. Nope. Vanessa was facing fines large enough to make even wealthy people lose sleep. The demolition began about a month later. And I'll admit something that probably doesn't make me look great. The first morning, I watched. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted her to suffer. But because after everything that had happened, it felt impossible to look away. Just after sunrise, trucks rolled into her driveway. Construction crews climbed out. Equipment started unloading. The same kind of efficient operation that had removed my trees. Only this time, the target was hers. The first concrete saw screamed through the morning air. Then came the jackhammers. The infinity pool she'd fought so hard to build began disappearing piece by piece. Water drained out in muddy streams. Stone cracked. Concrete shattered. By lunchtime, half the pool was gone. Vanessa stood nearby watching, her arms crossed tightly, her shoulders slumped. At one point, our eyes met across the fence. Neither of us waved. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't really anything left to say. The following months transformed the property again, but this time the changes looked very different. Instead of luxury contractors, environmental specialists arrived. Native species experts, forestry consultants, restoration crews. Young oak saplings appeared, maples, dogwoods, wildflowers. Slowly, the land began healing. One afternoon, an environmental biologist knocked on my door. We secured restoration funding for adjacent properties as well, she explained. You qualify. I looked toward the empty spaces in my yard, the spaces I tried not to stare at for nearly a year. Will it bring them back? She smiled gently. No. Then she added, but it gives the next generation a chance. That sentence stayed with me, because she was right. Nothing was bringing my trees back. Not the fines, not the investigations, not the court orders, not even justice itself. Justice is strange that way. People imagine it feels triumphant, like fireworks, like victory, music playing in the background. Most of the time it feels much quieter, more complicated. About 8 months later, a for sale sign appeared in Vanessa's front yard. The house sat there for months, then longer. Potential buyers would visit, admire the architecture, love the view, then ask questions. Eventually the price dropped, then dropped again. Finally, one evening, there was another knock on my front door. I opened it. Vanessa stood there. She looked different. Not older exactly, just lighter somehow. Like life had finally forced her to stop carrying a fight she couldn't win. I sold the house, she said. I nodded. I'm moving next week. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. I never hated your trees. I looked at her. Then why cut them down? She glanced toward the valley, toward the young saplings beginning to grow. Then she sighed. They reminded me that I didn't belong here. I wasn't expecting that. Not after everything. Not after the lawyers and investigations and arguments. She laughed quietly. You grew up here. Everybody knew you. Your family had roots. She paused. I spent my whole life trying to prove I deserve a place like this. Suddenly a lot of things made sense. Not excuses, just explanations. There's a difference. The trees had never really been the enemy. What they represented was history, belonging, roots she didn't have, or thought she didn't. You could have belonged, I said. You didn't have to erase anything. She looked away. Maybe because she agreed. Maybe because she didn't. Then she gave me a small nod and walked back toward the house. That was the last conversation we ever had. A younger couple bought the property a few months later. Their first weekend there, they brought over a bottle of wine and introduced themselves. The wife looked at the restoration project and smiled. It feels grounded. Grounded. I like that word. 3 years have passed now. The saplings are taller. Birds have returned. The shade is slowly coming back. Not as fast as I'd like. Nature rarely works on our schedule. Sometimes I still walk out to the old stumps and run my hand across the rings. You can see drought years. Wet years. Decades of history frozen inside the wood. People still ask whether it was worth fighting. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me says yes. Part of me wishes none of it had happened. What I do know is this. Communities survive when people remember that just because you can change something doesn't always mean you should. And sometimes the most important boundaries aren't fences or property lines. They're the ones we choose not to cross. So now I want to ask you, if you came home and discovered your neighbor had done what Vanessa did, would you have fought back the way I did? Or would you have let it go to keep the peace? And if you were in Vanessa's shoes, chasing a dream you'd worked your entire life to afford, would you have seen those trees as history or as obstacles? Let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand. And if this story made you think about property rights, community, or the hidden cost of ambition, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who has ever dealt with a neighbor dispute that got completely out of hand. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.